Hey YouTubers, this is Barcode checking in again. It looks like I'll be starting another comprehensive video series on a particular object of obsession. This time around it's going to be serial killers. So for those of you who haven't maybe followed my other video series on the Myers-Briggs type indicator, what I do is that I pick a particular topic that I have spent maybe a few years combing through the literature on, so I do know a fair amount about it, and I try to deliver it to you in sort of these friendly, hopefully not too intimidating, educational yet entertaining bite-sized chunks on YouTube. So what will happen today is I'm going to cover the introduction. So I'm going to go over some of the history of what we already know about serial killers. I'll go over some major definitions, and then finally I'll cover some where the research is right now and where it seems to be heading, and some problems that we're encountering in the research field. Before I start, disclaimer, the same one I use all the time. I am an undergraduate. This is just a result of my own research, my own synthesis. I am not an expert. Please do not consult me for your doctoral paper or anything. I've actually had people do that. No, I have no authority in this field. This is my own synthesis. So yeah, serial killers. Part 1, Introduction. Needless to say, serial killers are something that has captivated public attention for a very long time. Why is that? Maybe some people are scared that one day when they're bussing home from work, their kid's going to get kidnapped out of the bushes and because there's a serial killer on the loose. Maybe it's because serial killers are a lot more normal than people expect. And maybe that's what's so fascinating about them. We don't know, but needless to say, it is something that has captivated the public. So first of all, let's go into some of the history of serial killers. Again, this is YouTube. I have 10 minutes, not 10 hours. I cannot give you a thorough overview of the history. Needless to say, if you are interested, you should not be stopping here. But I'll be giving you sort of the 3 main points about the history of serial killers that you simply cannot not know. Okay. The first main point that you really need to understand is serial murder is absolutely nothing new. Now, to be clear here, I'm a misanthrope, which basically means that I don't believe that humanity is capable of very much, but the one thing that we do seem to have in spades is the ability to off each other in massive amounts in incredibly creatively sadistic ways. People have been killing each other since we could kill each other. Okay, and it's not like just because, you know, in the 1980s when the research took off, it's not just like because suddenly shows like Criminal Minds and Dexter started popping up that we had this huge influx of serial killers. That's not the case. Okay, serial killers have been around for a long time. For example, Guy de Rais. Okay, Guy de Rais was active during the 1400s. He killed and disemboweled, decapitated hundreds of children. Someone you may be more familiar with, Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was another serial killer that was active in the London area, and he was sort of infamous for killing prostitutes and then disemboweling them and otherwise mutilating them post-mortem. Jack the Ripper is actually mistakenly referred to quite a lot as the quote-unquote first serial killer. That's not necessarily true. Like I said before, Jack the Ripper is surely not the first fine specimen of humanity to go about killing each other in massive amounts in horrific ways. That being said, Jack the Ripper is the first serial killer as we define serial killer today. I'll illustrate this or elaborate on this a little further in future videos, but there is a big difference between someone who kills serially and a serial killer. As you'll discover later, the term serial killer is a very specific term. Another example, Marquis de Sade. Marquis de Sade was a Frenchman. In case you ever end up on Jeopardy and need this sort of more obscure piece of knowledge, the term sadism or sadistic is actually named after Marquis de Sade because, well, the guy was a sadistic jerk. And finally, a lot of historians, you may not know this, but a lot of historians speculate that a lot of this more supernatural mythology that originated in sort of a European or medieval Europe is actually contributed to a large part by serial killers. Now, obviously, that's not where the mythology originated, right? But imagine that you are a peasant in the Middle Ages. You don't know how to read or write. You've probably never been out of your village. You have a very sort of narrow view of the world. And then suddenly your sheriff starts pulling bodies of mutilated young girls out of the forest. What do we know about serial killers? They're mostly men, mostly sexually motivated, and most of the victims tend to be young girls. So if you're that peasant, what are you going to be thinking? You're going to be thinking, oh shit, there is a vampire in the woods. Oh crap, there's a werewolf in the forest. Obviously that's not where the mythology originated, but a lot of scholars do speculate that this is what sort of fanned the flames, so to speak. And let's face it here, it doesn't take very much. Second major thing you should know is this particular fellow doctor by the name of Krafft-Ebing. Krafft-Ebing wrote a very, very, very famous piece of work by the name of Psychopathy Sexualis. It's actually this book right here. It's pretty cheap. The original was written in Latin. There are a lot of sort of more contemporary English translations. You can probably pick this up at the local used bookstore for very, very cheap. But what made Krafft-Ebing so sort of indispensable and critical in the serial killing movement is that he was really the first guy to systematically document serial murder, okay? And it is this level of detail, and it was his level of sheer systematicity that made him so indispensable, right? Because up till then, serial killers were, well, first of all, the term didn't exist. But second of all, serial killing was this sort of very hazy phenomenon. We didn't really know that much about it. But what Dr. Krafft-Ebing did is that he took a whole bunch of people who, I mean, it's not just serial killers. He sort of explored a whole bunch of other things too, like paraphilias, necrophiliacs, incest, zoophilia, that kind of good stuff. And he would basically make these observations, and the level of detail of his observations was amazing. Now, that being said, this was 1886, and even though Krafft-Ebing did offer, a lot of explanations regarding what he thought the motivations were for these particular quote-unquote perversions, his sort of reasoning wasn't exactly sound. For one thing, a lot of them are not falsifiable. A lot of his explanations sort of reek of Freud. And for those of you who know me, you know that I'm not a fan of Freud. I'm not a fan of psychoanalytic theory in general. Penis envy and womb envy and all that. So his sort of explanations weren't that great, but his observations were amazingly detailed. And this is the first time anybody had ever done this to this sort of scale, really. Moreover, a lot of the things that he noticed in his manuscript, Psychopathy Sexualis, a lot of the observations that he made actually are very still relevant today, and we find that they do hold today. For example, he noted that some serial killers tend to leave very messy crime scenes, have a very low degree of control, whereas others, like Ted Bundy, he brought a rape kit with him. They were prepared. And now, what do we know that as today? Of course, that's the FBI dichotomy between the organized and the disorganized serial offenders. Krafft-Ebing also noticed that some serial killers tend to take trophies, right? So they would kill someone and then take something that belonged to them, or in some cases hack off specific body parts and then take them home with them, and so they could relive the experience. So, a lot of the things that he noticed, we're still noticing today. They were extremely valid. His reasoning's not so much, but again, Krafft-Ebing is sort of a big name in terms of the history of serial murder. Finally, the third big thing that you should really know when it comes to historical context is Robert Ressler. Robert Ressler is a very famous guy. He was the guy who actually coined the term serial killer, again, as we define serial killer today. This was around the 1970s, or about there, give or take a few years. But Robert Ressler, he was a criminal profiler. I put profiler in quotations because people don't realize that profiling isn't actually an official title. But basically, serial killers, criminal minds, that's kind of what he did, that sort of profiling thing. Again, real life, Hollywood, not really the same thing, but he was really the first guy to sort of push for, hey, serial offenders are not like other offenders. There is something there that is psychological in nature. They are receiving some sort of psychological gratification from it that is not explainable and is really quite anomalous. So really, he was the guy who pushed for this idea that serial offenders are a different breed altogether. So that's it for the history. So definitions, very, very important. Important because there is so much public misconception around this. The term serial killer is thrown around so much in sort of public and daily discourse that a lot of people don't realize really what they're saying. Your sort of layperson tends to equate serial killer with crazy or psychotic or psychopath, which again, if you've seen my earlier videos, you would know is not true. This is another sort of key controversy in the research field right now, the definition of serial killer. What I'm giving you here, what I'm presenting you here is sort of I wouldn't say the average, but sort of the general sort of expert consensus that people have. So what is a serial killer? This is an individual who has killed 3 or more people in generally in 3 or more locations. The key idea to take home here is this idea of a cooling off period. This basically means that a serial killer would kill one person, experience that as one separate emotional experience, and then go and kill another person, and that's a separate emotional experience. That is the key to defining a serial killer, and it's basically what distinguishes it from a spree killer, which I'll go into in the next slide. Another interesting thing to note is that a lot of scholars have noticed, a lot of researchers have noticed that the pattern that serial killers tend to take are quite rhythmic. They're quite cyclical. In fact, one particular author, I can't remember, I think it might have been Holmes and Holmes, who referred to it almost like a ritualistic sort of phenomenon. Research indicates that serial killers kill people because of something called negative affectivity. Affect is basically another word for emotion, right? So they kill to get sort of cope with negative emotions. So what happens is that this particular individual will experience negative affect, coupled with genetic predispositions, maybe a really shitty upbringing. They never develop proper coping mechanisms. They never develop sort of techniques to self-soothe or regulate their emotions. So they sort of dip into this depression. And then what they do is that they kill. And killing them just gives this incredible gratification, this incredible high, this incredible sort of feeling of control. But then after a while, it's just sort of once they've killed the person, it sort of plateaus for a while, and then it dips again, and then they kill again. So really, serial killing can be seen as, or some scholars speculate, can be seen as this sort of a very elaborate way to regulate your emotions to make yourself feel better. Really, I mean, that's what it comes down to. A lot of research indicates that serial killers kill because it makes them feel good. Not only that, it makes them feel good; it makes them feel better than they were before. So really, this cooling off period is quite critical to understanding the construct of serial murder. I should note here that serial killer is a criminological label only, which means that serial killer is not a diagnosis. It is not in the DSM-4 or 5 or probably 10 or ever will be. It is a criminological label only. Moreover, there's a sort of paradigm that you have to wrap your head around, and that is that a serial killer does not become a serial killer until they are caught. But research is conducted on uncaught serial killers. Does that make any sense? I'm not sure if it does, but basically what I'm saying is that it's a criminological, it's a legal label for someone who has followed a particular pattern. But obviously, if you've never caught them, then you can't slap that label on them. And that's what I mean by a criminological label only. And more thing I should also mention is that the bulk of what we know about serial killers has been conducted on male inmates, 36 male inmates. The FBI conducted sort of a large-scale survey on a bunch of incarcerated serial offenders, serial killers. So again, because they were all male, because the sample size, the N size was so small, we can't draw that many conclusions from it. But research in serial murder is still such a young field that really we have to work with what we have. So multicide. Multicide, as the name implies, is killing multiple people or multiple cases of homicide, abbreviated multicide. So this really handy chart that came from a book written by Holmes and Holmes in 1998 gives you sort of a really quick and easy cheat sheet on understanding the differences between mass murder, spree murder, and serial murder. Mass murder is someone who kills a whole bunch of people at once, as the name implies. Not rocket science. Spree murder is a little bit different. A spree murder and a serial murder are very similar. These 3 types of multicide offenders tend to differ on 4 different dimensions. The first dimension is victims, okay? So mass murderers generally kill at least 3 people. There's a great deal of controversy in the literature surrounding this, so that's why I put greater than 2 or 3, just if you're wondering. Spree murder, serial murder, again defined as people who kill 3 or more people. Events. Mass murderer, someone who kills a whole bunch of people at once in one event, one location, no cooling off period, one emotional experience. Okay? Now the distinction between serial murder and spree murder is a bit different. They're almost identical in the sense that they can take place over a period of time. They can involve they should involve multiple locations. But what makes it distinct is that a spree murderer will kill and kill and kill, but that entire thing is one emotional experience. Whereas again, a serial murderer would sort of experience that cooling off period. So in terms of examples, a good example of a mass murderer would be James Huberty. He basically walked into a McDonald's one day and then just like opened fire on 21 people and killed 21 people. So one event, one location, one emotional event. And we also find that when cornered by law enforcement, say, mass murderers have the highest probability of killing themselves. So a mass murderer's endgame tends to be suicide. An example of a spree murderer would be Charles Starkweather, and an example of a serial murderer would be, well, we have a lot of those. Like Ted Bundy, who is my personal favorite, but that sounded creepy. Okay, and last but not least, we need to take a look at some of the problems in terms of the research. Problems that researchers have encountered as they're trying to find more and more about serial killers, sort of their underlying pathology, their underlying motivations, why they do it, and maybe some of the more genetic predispositions or some of the familial factors that contribute to this phenomenon. But research on serial killers is not always easy. It's actually quite difficult if you think about it, because I'll go into prevalence again in the next video when I talk about characteristics, but serial killers are actually very rare. A lot of people don't sort of realize this because it's so hyped up in the media, but serial killers are very, very, very rare. And that in part has contributed to why there is so little research on serial killers. In fact, Mary O'Toole, who was a criminal profiler with the FBI, she mentioned at a public lecture, of the CUNY lecture series in New York, she mentioned at a public lecture that there have only been about 70 or so papers on serial murder as of 2003, which is a utter paucity of knowledge. If you are in academic circles at all, 72 papers is ridiculous. That is nothing. That is a field that is in its utter infancy. We know very little about it, and why? Because serial murder is not a priority. Law enforcement does not consider serial murder a priority, even though your average, Joe across the street thinks that he doesn't feel safe walking home at night because he's going to get off by some random serial killer. Serial murders are actually very, very, very rare. And even though it seems like the rates are increasing, a lot of people speculate that this is just, again, one of the caveats of this sort of epidemiological research is that it's a function of your survey quality. So it's not that serial killers are more rising or the number of them are rising, it's that we're getting better at picking them out. And that's what leads me back to this issue of linkage blindness. Linkage blindness is a term that refers to the inability for law enforcement to communicate with each other across jurisdictions to identify serial killers. Because I can tell you right now, from what I understand and from speaking with some professors in the area, that the issue with serial killers is not stopping them. This problem is not deciding what to do with them. The problem is identifying them. A lot of people don't realize that police departments in different jurisdictions don't talk to each other very much. They don't communicate because every police department is just so overloaded with cases. If your case doesn't get solved after a while, it's abandoned essentially, and to work on to pick up fresher leads. And what does this mean for the serial killer? It means that for the smarter serial killer who is more mobile, again, going back to Ted Bundy basically what he did, he would drive around and kill. He would drive across state lines to kill, which is incredibly clever because it took a while for the police department to share their knowledge, to pool their information, and that is how they identified them. And that is a major barrier in identifying serial killers in operation today. This idea of linkage blindness, this idea of documentation. There are a lot of serial killers in the United States alone, North America alone, but we seriously doubt that that's because somehow Americans are crazier or somehow more violent or somehow more predisposed to be serial killers. It's probably because if you're looking at other countries, which are still developing, there may be corruption in the government, corruption in the police force, no communication between police jurisdictions, very poor documentation. It can take a lot of time, if it ever happens, for police to finally talk to each other and say, holy crap, there is a guy who's been killing in multiple areas in the exact same way. How did we not notice this? Fortunately, there has been a solution. There's been a program that was released called the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, released in 1985. And this was basically a giant repository of information about violent crimes. And basically what it does is that if the algorithm of the program notices a pattern, it will alert law enforcement so that they know that they need to take this particular piece of information and share it with other jurisdictions because there may be a serial offender at work. So yeah, that would be the video 1 introduction. Next video, I'll be going into characteristics of serial killers, and then video 3 I'm anticipating will be typologies. So if you've enjoyed this, hopefully subscribe and keep watching. So thanks.